Another day, another story. The 1994 Rwandan genocide was one of the most horrific acts of mass violence in the 20th century. Over the span of about 100 days, from April to July 1994, an estimated 800,000 to 1 million people, primarily Tutsi, were brutally murdered by extremist members of the Hutu majority. The genocide was sparked by long-standing ethnic tensions between the Hutu and Tutsi groups, inflamed by political propaganda and manipulation. Key details about the genocide. Welcome to Tabo Eminent Channel. Ethnic context. Historically, the Hutu and Tutsi were not distinct racial groups, but rather social categories. The colonial powers, first Germany and then Belgium, exacerbated tensions by reinforcing ethnic divisions and favoring the Tutsi minority, which led to resentment among the Hutu majority. Trigger. The genocide was triggered by the assassination of the then president of Rwanda, Juvenal Habyarimana, a Hutu, when his plane was shot down on April 6, 1994. Although the perpetrators of the assassination are still debated, Hutu extremists used this event to initiate a systematic massacre of the Tutsi population and moderate Hutus. Systematic killings. Hutu extremists, including members of the Interahamwe militia and ordinary citizens, went door to door, setting up roadblocks to identify and slaughter Tutsi civilians. The killings were carried out using machetes, clubs, and firearms, often in the most brutal and public ways. Role of media and government. The genocidal campaign was coordinated by the government and amplified through state-run media, particularly the radio station Radio Television Libre des Mille Collines, RTLM, which broadcasted propaganda, calling for the extermination of the Tutsi people and directing attackers to their targets. International response. The international community, including the United Nations, largely failed to intervene. Peacekeeping forces present in Rwanda were withdrawn, and despite warnings from within, the genocide was allowed to continue almost unchecked. Historical background. Pre-colonial Rwanda. Before European colonization, Rwanda was a kingdom with a hierarchical system, but the Hutu and Tutsi were more socio-economic categories than rigid ethnic groups. Tutsis were traditionally wealthier cattle herders, while Hutus were farmers. Mobility between the two groups was possible, though Tutsis often held more power. Colonial influence. When the Germans, and later the Belgians, colonized Rwanda, they categorized the population more strictly by ethnicity, favoring the Tutsi minority for administrative roles, believing them to be racially superior because of European pseudo-scientific racial theories. This preferential treatment deepened divisions between the Tutsi and Hutu. Independence and ethnic tensions. After Rwanda gained independence from Belgium in 1962, the power dynamics shifted, with the Hutu majority gaining political control. A series of ethnic conflicts and massacres occurred between the two groups in the following decades, fueling resentment and radicalization, particularly among Hutu extremists. Prelude to genocide. Habyarimana's regime. Juvenal Habyarimana, a Hutu, came to power in 1973 through a coup and led an authoritarian government that marginalized the Tutsi minority. Ethnic tensions simmered throughout the 1980s and early 1990s, as Tutsi refugees who had fled earlier violence formed the Rwandan Patriotic Front, RPF, which began a civil war in 1990. Peace talks and rising extremism. In 1993, a ceasefire and power-sharing agreement between the RPF and the Habyarimana government, known as the Arusha Accords, aimed to end the civil war. However, hardline Hutu extremists, opposed to sharing power with Tutsis, began plotting the genocide in secret. Extremist rhetoric intensified, particularly through media outlets like RTLM, which spread anti-Tutsi propaganda, referring to them as cockroaches that needed extermination. Execution of the genocide. Habyarimana's assassination. On April 6, 1994, President Habyarimana's plane was shot down, killing him and the Burundian president. This event acted as the final spark for the genocide. While responsibility for the assassination remains contested, Hutu extremists blamed the RPF and launched a premeditated plan to exterminate the Tutsi population. Mass slaughter begins. Within hours of the plane crash, roadblocks were set up across Kigali, and the killing of Tutsis began in earnest. Ordinary citizens, spurred on by local leaders, military officers, and media, were encouraged to take part in the massacres. Tutsis were hunted down in their homes, schools, churches, and even hospitals. Whole families were murdered with machetes, clubs, and guns, often by neighbors or friends. The role of women and children. Targeting of women. Many Tutsi women were systematically raped, tortured, and mutilated before being killed. Rape was used as a weapon of war, with an estimated 250,000 to 500,000 women being subjected to sexual violence during the genocide. Survivors were often left with long-term physical and psychological trauma, and many bore children as a result of the rapes. Children as victims and perpetrators. Children were not spared in the violence. Many were slaughtered alongside their families, while others were recruited by the militias and forced to participate in the killings. The genocide left a generation of orphans, many of whom were severely traumatized. International response. UN failure to intervene. The United Nations Assistance Mission for Rwanda, UNAMIR, was present in the country but lacked the mandate and resources to intervene. General Romeo Dallaire, the commander of UNAMIR, repeatedly warned the international community about the impending massacre and requested reinforcements, but his pleas were largely ignored. End of the genocide. RPF's victory. The genocide was brought to an end in mid-July 1994 when the RPF, under the leadership of Paul Kagame, advanced from the north and took control of the country. While the RPF was initially formed to fight for the rights of Tutsi refugees, they became the force that stopped the genocide by defeating the Hutu government and militia groups. Flight of perpetrators. Many of those responsible for the genocide fled to neighboring countries, especially Zaire, now the Democratic Republic of the Congo, where they lived in refugee camps and continued to wage guerrilla attacks against the new Rwandan government. Aftermath and justice. Humanitarian crisis. In the wake of the genocide, Rwanda faced a massive humanitarian crisis. Millions of people were displaced, both inside and outside the country, and the infrastructure was destroyed. The psychological and emotional scars left by the violence were immense. National rebuilding and reconciliation. Under Kagame's leadership, Rwanda has focused on rebuilding and fostering national unity. The government implemented policies to reduce ethnic distinctions and promote reconciliation. Rwanda is now often cited as a model for post-conflict recovery, though some critics argue that Kagame's government has suppressed political opposition and limited freedom of speech in the name of stability. Commemoration and legacy. Memorialization. Every year, Rwanda holds national commemoration ceremonies to remember the victims of the genocide. The Kigali Genocide Memorial, where over 250,000 victims are buried, serves as a place of remembrance and education for Rwandans and international visitors. Impact on global policy. The Rwandan genocide profoundly affected global policy on humanitarian intervention. The Rwandan genocide remains a powerful reminder of the dangers of unchecked hatred, the consequences of division along ethnic lines, and the importance of timely intervention in the face of mass atrocities. Thanks for watching. Request you to subscribe the channel.